MOBAs are the most toxic, boring, and annoying game genres to ever exist. And yet, for the longest time, I loved them. I wasted so much life on League of Legends that could have been otherwise used for something more productive. It wasn't all bad though. I remember vividly making good friends and almost religiously playing with them every Friday in a warm, stingy room like proper gamers. But as time went on, we went to different cities, went to different jobs, schools, and life happened. At the same time, I got frustrated at League and just stopped playing. Still, LoL never left my life. I kept watching Worlds and LCS, and sometimes I just watched people like GBig99, Tobias Fate, and Magikarp use Fly. Every now and again, I remember the massive amount of MOBAs being released after the success of Dota and LoL. Some might remember Strife, Infinite Crisis, and Battle Right, but there were way more MOBAs out there, and we're going to take a look at them and explain a little bit why they succeeded or why they failed. I think by now, everyone that is even slightly interested in MOBAs knows roughly where they come from. If you don't, Google is your friend. It's far more important to know what a MOBA actually is, and here's where we have a little bit of a problem. We don't have a definition for MOBAs. It does spell out multiplayer online battle arenas, but this generally speaking means nothing. There are a few common things for the genre though. You get access to one character that has abilities with certain cooldowns and one special ability called an ultimate. There are neutral objectives like an orb or mini-boss that can provide your team with certain advantages. And most MOBAs have units called minions that just continuously spawn on the map and fight against each other, providing the player with gold and experience. Some MOBAs have a leveling and item system during each game, and some opt out of it. Understandably, the ones without levels and without items also usually don't have minions. The general win condition for MOBAs is to kill the entirety of the enemy team or to destroy the enemy's base. There are several variations on that format, for example Score Hunt, but Team Annihilation and Base Destruction are the most common ones. With all that said, MOBAs have slowly become a description for isometric action RPGs akin to Diablo and Torchlight, and I have to say, I use MOBA as descriptor that way as well, even though it's imprecise. Also, while I see certain things as MOBAs, you might disagree with me, and that is totally fine because we don't actually have a definition of what a MOBA actually is. It's a term that was coined around the release of LoL to get rid of the term Dota clone. The most precise for most MOBAs would be isometric online multiplayer real-time strategy role-playing games, but IOM RTS RPG doesn't sound as nice as MOBAs. Genre definitions are stupid, some are just more stupid than others. I think it's more important that we roughly know what it means. Getting into the nitty-gritty really doesn't help anyone. I don't think we have to talk about League of Legends or Dota 2. Those are clearly the top dogs at the moment. Especially League of Legends has established itself as a genuine esports at this point. They are both not going anywhere anytime soon. Probably the most well-known MOBA shooter though is Overwatch. While it incorporates facets from typical shooters like a payload, it is drenched in MOBA DNA, as you can see with character abilities and characters themselves. Everyone claiming it's not. Fuck you! Blizzard of course has its own classical MOBA called Heroes of the Storm, and after a failed attempt to force HOTS into becoming an esports, the game is now in maintenance mode, and while I don't have player numbers for HOTS, it is most likely on its decline. In Overwatch's shadow is of course Paladins. Funny enough, Paladins has its own mobile MOBA called Paladins Strike. Still, Paladins is successful on its own right, but has always been seen as the Overwatch clone, and since Hi-Res seems to be more interested in hopping on trends than anything else, the game doesn't seem to have a very bright future, even though it's still pulling numbers. By the way, I think now we call those games hero shooters. Mixing MOBAs and shooters makes a lot of sense of course, but even back when I was playing League, I wondered why nobody had already made a third-person MOBA until Smite came out and understandably blew up. Smite was one of the first third-person MOBAs to succeed in the genre, by far not the only one to exist, but the only one that survived. I think what really draws people in is that Smite characters are gods, and that in itself is a very interesting premise. Being the first mover in the market might have helped Smite's success a lot. Of course, we can't forget about the MOBA market, and here we have the three giants called the Mobile Legends by Moontoon, Arena of Valor by Tencent, and Brawl Stars by Supercell. Mobile Legends was one of the first mobile MOBAs, so they had a first mover advantage, but you probably guessed why Arena of Valor and Brawl Stars succeeded. Tencent is a hugely powerful company, they can just buy their way into markets, and Supercell is well known for their predatory monetization schemes, so it's no wonder that they both would generate a fuck ton of money. These are only the giants of the industry, of course. There are probably way more examples. I could list a bunch of them here, but they are fairly uninteresting. So I think it's now time to talk about the failures. Quick disclaimer, there are too many MOBAs to talk about. I have a list of roughly 100 MOBAs, and every time I blink, I have to add a new MOBA because there are so many of them. And as always, forgive me if I get dates or certain infos wrong because, you know, those games are very old and some of them are barely documented. Also, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Anyways, since MOBAs are very personal to me, I think I should start with the ones I experienced the most. Battle Right is probably the best MOBA I ever played. Every now and again, I download the game, play a few rounds and think to myself, holy moly, this is a good game. And then I stop playing. I don't know what's wrong with this game. If I could guess, I would say this game has a very high skill ceiling, turning people away that don't want to spend a lot of time on the game. The casual nature of games like LoL and Dota is gone because the gamers are so hyper-focused on the competitive side. Besides that, Stunlock Studios might have made some strategic faux pas by hiring too many people at once when their game took off and not waiting for the player base to stabilize. While the game is still playable and still has a decent amount of players, Battle Right is in its maintenance mode, and with time it will slowly lose its remaining player base. Another similar game that I really liked to play was Solstice Arena, developed and published by Zynga. It was basically a cheaper version of Bloodlight Champions with no unique attribute whatsoever. I just liked the game. The reason why you can't play this game anymore should be fairly obvious if you know anything about Zynga. Those are the same guys who made Farmville, and that should be enough information to understand why this game was killed off. Super Monday Night Combat, on the other hand, was apparently killed off because certain laws changing in the EU. This game was the successor to Monday Night Combat, which you can still play, and implements typical MOBA elements like towers and buffs to a third-person shooter. The twist was that you could rebuild towers during the game and buy buffs with your earned money. It was a very interesting, unique concept, but unfortunately it didn't really capture the Monday Night Combat audience, nor the MOBA audience. I think also when we talk about MOBAs, we can't forget to talk about Strife. That game tried to make MOBAs really accessible with things like shared gold, passive life regeneration, and smaller maps. It was intended to be an entry-level MOBA by the same people who made Heroes of New Earth, and it also had a story-based tutorial. Funny enough, that's the part I remember the most about Strife, and yet you can barely find any info on that part of the game. It was the one thing that made it stand out, and yet I never heard anyone talking about it. Strife servers were active for a very long time and eventually shut down in 2018 with S2 games nowhere to be found. It is assumed that they have shut down, but there's no official statement as of this date. Another game that flew under the radar and then was quietly shut down was Ace Arena Combat Evolved. It was more of a hockey game with special abilities than a MOBA. I would say it was more fantasy sports like Rocket League. Still, at the time, we called it Hockey MOBA. As much as I liked the game, it was a bit pay to win, and it was noticeable. There's really nothing special about the story of Ace. It simply couldn't find a big enough player base, and at some point they ran out of money, so they decided to cut their losses. Personally, I think having the name Ace is stupid because nobody's ever going to find your game ever, for obvious reasons. Moving on from my personal experiences to all the games that were killed by the publisher. Just to be clear, the reasons why those games failed are not only necessarily because the publishers, but it's a main reason. And right from the start, we have two games from EA that got cancelled before they even saw the light of day. Warhammer Online, Wrath of Heroes and Dawngate had a beta phase and immediately got shafted for unknown reasons. Warhammer was being developed by Mythic, a studio that doesn't exist anymore because EA shut it down, and Dawngate was or is trying to be revived by Studio Wayfinder. They even had a successful Kickstarter, but as far as I could see, there isn't much info on Project Dreambound. They have a Discord where you can read a bunch of information on it. Also, people on Kickstarter are asking for a refund recently, and the last update as of mid mid-2021 was in September 2020. I would say both those games are dead. Another publisher with a similar reputation to EA is Warner Brothers. Compared to EA, who is at least competent in what they're doing, Warner Brothers seem to be the most incompetent publisher of the 2010s. Every single one of the releases has some sort of problem because they can't help themselves being too greedy for their own good. Irregardless, the DC intellectual property is still huge and will generate money no matter what you do, except if you fuck up so hard that nobody wants to play your game. Infinite Crisis was a typical MOBA a la League and tried to innovate things by adding environmental objects as damage dealers, and instead of going for a typical 3-lane map, they tried a Dominion map. None of those things mattered, because the project was mishandled from top to bottom. At the end, what killed the game was a lack of vision, the insane decision to have mostly characters from alternative universes, and the absolute lack of marketing from Warner Brothers, even though they had shows like The Flash, Arrow, and Supergirl running at the time. Funny enough, there is an Android game called DC Battle Arena that is basically just LOL with chibi versions of the DC mainline characters, which in itself is a response to a MOBA game from Marvel NetEase, Marvel Super War, which is just LOL with a Marvel skin. Both of those games make probably more money than I will ever see my entire life, so fuck me, I guess. The other failed MOBA from Warner was Guardians of Middle-earth, developed by Monolith. It is not available on PC anymore, and I guess it might have something to do with licenses. Many games have been taken off the Steam store because of licensing issues throughout the years. Anyways, the idea of a console MOBA is always interesting to me, and according to Mad Mike's review, it was well executed. Unfortunately, I never heard about this game in my entire life, and on top of that, it did cost money at release with paid DLC afterwards. So basically, they made this game fail before it was even released. If EA is a bad publisher and Warner Brothers is worse, then Gearbox might be tying number 3. Gearbox is a fairly well-known publisher / developer, and they also tried their hand on their own MOBA shooter called Battleborn. Unfortunately, they were trying to compete with Blizzard at the time and had basically no idea what the game wanted to be. Also, while the art style was great, the colors and effects made it really difficult to see everything in first person. From one bad publisher to another, we have Deep Silver Interactive with Dead Island Epidemic, and if you guessed that Stunlock Studios made that game, then you would be correct. And if you're wondering if those are the same people who made Bloodline Champions and Battle Ride, you would also be correct. By the way, both failed titles, once again, shown that quality does not equal success necessarily. Because, if you want it or not, those guys make the best, most balanced MOBAs in existence, and yet it seems like they can't catch a break. In this specific case though, it was Deep Silver not understanding their target audience whatsoever and just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping it sticks. Another publisher that wanted in on the MOBA hype was Bandai Namco. They tried to get their feet wet with a game called Supernova, developed by Primal Game Studios, but apparently they pulled out at some point, and while you can still play the game, it is no longer supported. Square Enix tried their luck with Lord Vermilion Arena, which was at some point shut down, revamped and made into a MOBA game. Unfortunately, there's barely any info on the game, but given that it's often described as a card game MOBA hybrid, I can imagine that monetization led to its demise, or the license of the Lord Vermilion IP had something to do with it. Arena of Fate was an interesting MOBA developed by Crytek. Yes, we're talking about the same people who made CryEngine and Crysis. Similar to Smite, the characters were plucked right out of the mythical realm, but instead of gods, they were trying to use legends and fairy tales like Red Riding Hood, Jack the Ripper, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Unfortunately, Crytek went under, and along with it went Arena of Fate. Crytek still exists today, but at this point I don't even know who officially owns it anymore. A similar thing happened with Fracture Space, a relatively unique take on the genre because it took out in outer space. Unfortunately, Edgecase, the developers of the game, were bought by Wargaming, which has no interest in reviving the game whatsoever. The reason being, of course, because they have their own successful cash cow in World of Tanks. Of course, the concept of a space combat MOBA was quickly followed up by Dreadnought, Fringe Wars, and Cloud Pirates. Dreadnought was never really popular to begin with, and while you can still play it, it's on its way out. Fringe Wars was never released, and it seems that the developers have actually never released a game in the West at least. And Cloud Pirates was developed by Mycom, more specifically ALOD, and if you know anything about Mycom, they are well known to quickly shaft games once they don't make enough money, which seems to be the case here. Netmarble has a similar reputation to MyCom, but on the mobile market. Probably one of the main reasons why Star Wars Force Arena was killed off. It was a very simplified MOBA, playable on phones, and being a Star Wars game alone gave it a huge pull. To a certain extent, it is understandable since there are other games like Lineage 2 and Marvel Future Fight make a lot of money. Concentrating time and resources on a game that doesn't make as much money as the other ones is business-wise a waste of time. I can also imagine that the license for Star Wars costs quite a bit, so I wouldn't be surprised if contract negotiations fell apart between Netmarble and Lucasfilm/Disney. I think the most tragic death by publisher must be gigantic though. The main reason why the game failed might have been that different investors wanted several different things at the same time, and Motiga, the developer, was constantly hemorrhaging money even before producing a single product. Throughout its development, Motiga acquired Microsoft and Perfect World as investors, which both wanted the game to be exclusive to their stores. So basically the game was doomed to fail from the start because from the outset the player base was going to be small. It's an extremely stupid idea to make multiplayer games exclusive to a platform or store if you don't have the money to back it up. Exclusive multiplayer games will always suffer from a low player count, which always means the death of a game. Last on the death by publisher list we have Realm of Titans, a relatively early attempt to cash in on the hype for LoL and Dota published by Area Games that never really saw the light of day. Realm of Titans in itself is pretty uninteresting. There's no special art style, there's no twist on the genre, it is a Dota clone with more angular maps instead of slanted ones. Area Games on the other hand is a much more interesting company to talk about because they belong to the Gamingo group, and Gamingo owns a little title called Atlas Rogue, and Atlas Rogue had a predecessor called Atlas Reactor. Atlas Reactor was a MOBA turn-based hybrid where every character would move at the end of a turn, and if that sounds odd, it's because it is. The reason why turn-based games are played always in exchange and not simultaneously is to offer the opponent a chance to hit each other. The strategy in a typical TBS consists mostly of positioning, item usage, and ability usage. And here's where we have a big problem. You have a mix of TBS and RTS, but neither are really being well executed. It's a bit confusing, and while the idea was novel, I don't know what the target audience even was. Plus the trailer and marketing of this game made it look like a third-person shooter rather than a turn-based MOBA. It seems like many games of this early era of MOBAs were a little bit confused. Prime World, for example, was a mix of base building mechanics a la Clash of Clans, a typical MOBA, capture the flag, and a marble shooting minigame. I'm actually not joking. In the middle of a match you could just play marbles. Understandably, the game failed, but was revived under the name Prime Arena, which tried to jump on the Battle Royale craze at the time. So basically Nidal, the developers, just took the same assets and tried to make a BR. Both games were pay to win, by the way, so I'm pretty sure nobody is surprised by their failure. Master X Master was not directly pay to win, but he didn't really knew what he wanted to be either. He had a PvE mode where you fought through a dungeon, he had a conventional 5v5 3-lane map, and a 3v3 arena map. What made this game special was the ability to switch between two characters during a match, breaking the conventional roles of ADC, mid, jungle, and tank. Unfortunately, the game was a bit greedy in its monetization. To upgrade characters, you had to run dungeons, but you only had limited runs per day as a free-to-play player, and on top of that, jobs were not guaranteed. So basically the people who only wanted to play PvP modes were forced to grind the PvE mode, which probably drove off a decent portion of the player base. On top of all of that, one of the first updates made the game even more for grind than it was before, so understandably it died off pretty quickly and was shut down after a very short lifespan. Panzer, Golden Rush, and Heroes Evolved died, at least on PC, for a simple reason. They were literally pay to win. Golden Rush, weirdly enough, has a post on the Steam forums explaining that's not pay to win. The problem is that they define pay to win as a critical advantage in the game that cannot be obtained in any other way. Technically, this is true, but the grind is always designed in such a way that the player is almost forced into paying money to be competitive, and just because you can eventually get all the advantages a paying player has, it doesn't make your game not pay to win. Panzer never tried to excuse itself, it was unashamedly pay to win, but this game is special because this might be the first third-person MOBA to exist. It's a good game at its core, but the grind is just too much. You can still play it, but I wouldn't be surprised if most people drop the game immediately since there's barely anyone playing. One interesting tidbit here is that XQC had a sponsored stream for their next game called Total Lockdown, and his chat just rails on the game all the time. I find it kind of funny, we should watch it. Talking about third-person MOBAs, we can't forget, of course, Paragon, by a little company you might know called Epic Games. Paragon was very successful at some point, but some things led to its demise. The major reason why Paragon failed was a lack of vision. Initially, Paragon was supposed to iterate on the MOBA genre, taking everything a typical MOBA had, like a 3-lane structure, a jungle, roles, and things like last hitting into the 3D space. With every major change though, the game turned more and more into an arena shooter, which alienated the MOBA audience, and on top of that, they also made the game kind of pay to win with that confusing card system, which was supposed to replace the typical item shop most MOBAs have. The final nail in the coffin was the mega success of Fortnite, and with a cash cow at hand, Paragon was just left by the wayside and shut down after roughly 2 years of open beta. The idea of Paragon stuck with a decent amount of people though, and so a few successors tried or are trying their hand at a revival, especially since Epic released their assets free of charge for the Unity engine. Phoenix Rising was the first project to pick up the scraps, but since their Twitter seems to be inactive since 2018 and there is barely any information on the project, it is most likely cancelled. The other major competitors are Fold, Project Core, Predecessors, Overprime, and Ethereal Clash of Souls. All of them seem to exist in this state of uncertainty. Fold is playable in early access and costs $20. Predecessors had closed user tests already and are officially endorsed by Epic with $1,000. Ethereal seems to have an active YouTube channel with updates on pre-alpha releases. And I swear to Satan, the next person to put pre-alpha anywhere, I'm going to punch in the stomach, because pre-alphas do not exist. It's a made-up marketing term that means absolutely fucking nothing. Anyways, Project Core realized that by using Paragon assets, they would be eternally bound to Epic/Tencent and are going through the painful process of rebuilding all of the assets. Finally, Overprime exists and is streamed often. Other than that, all the projects seem to be in their infancy. I can say with certainty there will be only one winner, if at all. MOBAs are not in their prime anymore, and having 5 different projects basically remaking the same game will lead to one taking over the others, or maybe all of them will cannibalize the same audience and cause each other's demise. Speaking of cannibals, cannibalization seems to happen a lot on the MOBA platform. We already mentioned a few of them, but like I said, I'm not really interested. The far more interesting topic for me are the developers and publishers behind those games. So let's talk about Tencent. They own, of course, Epic, which made the failed Paragon. They own 100% of Rito, who of course made League of Legends. I already mentioned Arena of Valor, but they also have their Chinese version of the game called Honor of Kings, and these are only the games I could directly link back to Tencent. There are probably way more that I just can't find because they're not directly linked. And if you thought Tencent is unique in that field, we can't forget about our friends NetEase. NetEase has Marvel Super War, as already mentioned, Onimusha Arena, Extraordinary Ones, and a title I couldn't find anything about because it's completely gone from the internet called NetEase All-Stars. The most interesting info about NetEase though is that they are responsible for Knives Out, which is a direct clone of PUBG, Creative Destruction, which is a direct clone of Fortnite, and Identity V, which is kind of a clone of Dead by Daylight. And all of those couldn't find any footing on PC if they released on PC at all, but most of the time they're hugely successful on mobile, and especially in Asia. So NetEase really doesn't care. While it is interesting to talk about the corporations behind those mobile games, like I said, the games are pretty mediocre. It's not interesting to talk about them. But under this pile of mediocrity, there are games that try to innovate or iterate on the whole MOBA genre. Switchblade and Heavy Machines tried their luck by giving everyone cars. Switchblade went for a more classical MOBA style with towers and minions, and Heavy Metal Machines tried to incorporate more racing/ball sports into the mix like Ace. We can't forget about the games that tried to go back to the roots of RTS. Drop Zone tried to give a control over 3 units instead of 1, and Airmech went all the way back to Herzog 2 and copied some of its mechanics. Of course, it was only a question of time until someone tried to make a 2D indie MOBA. Hugely anticipated and immediately forgotten was Hyper Universe. Alongside that, we had Awesome Nauts, which you can still play but has a very low player count. Some developers also tried to streamline certain aspects of MOBAs. One Tower made the whole map into a lane similar to Arams in League of Legends, but only with 1v1 modes. Tome Immortal Arena got rid of the last hitting, going back to base to buy items, and added a 7v7 mode. Sins of a Dark Age also streamlined the whole laning process, added game-wide quests in matches, which are comparable to something like Dragons in LoL, and also added items that would fundamentally change how champions play. Grimoire, Mana Storm, and Dark Eclipse are two of those examples where we might be stretching the definition of a MOBA a bit thin. Mana Storm is interesting because it's basically a wizard MOBA, and I personally love wizards, and Dark Eclipse is a VR game. The thing is that Dark Eclipse is more of an RTS than a MOBA. I would say calling this one a MOBA is heavily debatable. Most of those games can still be played to a certain extent, but their player base is very low, and it's only a question of time until you won't be able to play them anymore. And at this point, we talked about the successes, we talked about the failures, and we talked about the innovators, which means we need to talk about the forgotten ones. On the side, you will see a bunch of games scrolling. Those are games that exist. They just exist. There might be one or two interesting games like Games of Glory, Deadbreed, King of Wushu, and Spellsworn, but generally speaking, there's nothing special about them. Some might not even be classical MOBAs. And here I want to talk about the big reason why MOBAs fail. For that, I want to go back to a little title called World of Warcraft from our friends over at Blizzard. WoW wasn't an overnight success. Blizzard was an already established studio. They had experienced designers, developers, community managers, artists, musicians, and so on. They already had a strong brand after releasing landmark titles like Warcraft and Diablo, as well as an established lore and universe built through several games that would hook people in no matter what. The success of World of Warcraft was no mistake. And after the success of WoW, a bunch of titles tried to dethrone WoW by copying and iterating on its systems, but most of them failed. The reasons why they failed was not because they were worse or better than WoW. There's actually several reasons why they failed. One of the major reasons why they failed was of course market saturation. If you think about it though, you as a developer, you're not fighting WoW the video game. You're fighting Blizzard the company, World of Warcraft the brand, and by that point, almost a decade of development. And all of those things go for MOBAs as well. You cannot compete with Dota and League. You won't dethrone any of those games. They both have almost a decade of development, strong brand recognition, and a very successful company behind them. Games that just copy Dota and League will fail. Also, relying on brand recognition alone will not really help you if you don't make a good game, as we saw with Infinite Crisis. Another good example here is Adventure Time Battle Party. Believe it or not, this was a game that you could play on your browser and was well known at the time, especially because Adventure Time was so big when it launched. The whole thing was taken more as a joke though, and so it could never really develop beyond that. And as a developer, you should also learn from other people's mistakes. It seems like high-skill arena MOBAs like Battlerite are not really engaging as the typical MOBA, and I assume the reason being that the skill ceiling is very high. Console MOBAs, while an interesting idea, seem to narrow the player base down too much, making it difficult to keep consistent numbers, as we already saw with Guardians of Middle-earth, but also games like Genesis. Genesis even had a hiccup during its runtime where the servers shut down for no apparent reason, without communication whatsoever to the community, and everyone thought the game was down for good. Communication is important, and it's doubly important when it comes to your launches. Throughout the years we had some really bad launches like Demons Are Crazy, Bleeding Edge, Demigod, and Crucible. Crucible being the weirdest launch of them all. The game basically had no idea what it wanted to be, was taken back into beta, cut in half, and kept into beta until it was shut down. I've never heard of a game going back into beta after release. The game was dead on arrival. Well, and Demigod was truly doomed from day one as well. The game had all the cards stacked in its favor. It had the first mover advantage, people were hyped for the game, and it was one of the first commercially traded MOBAs. Unfortunately, the game was sold before the servers were online, had huge issues at release, and it did cost $40. By the time all the issues were resolved, LoL was released as a free-to-play game and had released so many champions that it was unbelievable how they could keep that up. And also, Hon, the direct competitor to Demigod, it only cost $30. And since we already name dropped Hon, we need to talk about Heroes of New Earth. Besides Dota and LoL, it was the third big player in the ring, and honestly, it could have gone either way. At first glance, there is no special reason why Horn lost to LoL. In hindsight, we can talk about how Horn looked darker and grittier and LoL was more vibrant and colorful, but to be honest, both were trying to be edgy with their art style. The big difference is probably that Horn was a bit more complex than LoL in its early game. I think this is something people could have gotten used to though. What really separated Horn from other MOBAs was its toxicity. The game showed you the MMR, which is kind of equivalency to the skill rating of someone in champion selects, and that led to a lot of weird mechanics and behaviors for players. People that had high MMR were forced into roles like mid and jungle, and people with low MMR were forced in roles like support. All MOBAs have some sort of toxicity, but usually it is never encouraged by the game itself. And also, as already mentioned, the game did cost money. They eventually switched their model, but at that point it was already too late. With the release of Dota 2, Horn was then finally killed off. You can still play the game and there are some semi-regular patches, but I am not sure how long the project can exist with no influx of new players. Also, it seems that S2 as a company doesn't really exist anymore. And with that, again, we reach the end of our journey. These are merely a fraction of MOBAs I could cover and talk about. There are probably more that I couldn't found or were unannounced and never released, cancelled or vanished otherwise. Developers are still trying their luck though. We have the Immortal Mystics that is backed up by a Spanish YouTuber, Fangs, which basically has no info on it, and Circuits and Shields who are trying to mix Battle Right and Ace, but to be quite honest, I think they will all fail. I will try to make this short because throughout the video I was already explaining why those MOBA games failed. Also, if you watch the conclusion part of the failed Battle Royale videos, you can basically take everything I said there and apply it here as well. Generally speaking, if you don't have money to back up your game, give up. Every successful MOBA is either the first mover in the genre, which you cannot be anymore, or they are backed up by an already established and profitable company. A MOBA, like Battle Royales, should never be your first game as a company, especially not as an indie developer. It doesn't matter if your game is the best game out there. If you're unable to make new champions in a short period of time, push changes, patches, fixes, extra content out in a consistent basis, you will most likely fail, and if you can, failure rate is high. Launch issues will always set your game behind. Not realizing how big your audience is and growing your company too fast will always spell doom for you. Making a MOBA for purely monetary reasons is generally speaking not the best idea, especially if you don't have the funds to market it. And of course, the market is saturated. The only way to succeed in this genre is by doing something truly unique and new. But even if you do, success is not guaranteed. Surely we will get more MOBAs in the future, but most of them will die with high certainty. Once again, I am sorry if I get any infos wrong or dates wrong. Please correct me in the comments. And as always, take care of yourselves and have a nice, wonderful day.